You know that scene in every Napoleon movie where his army is trudging through Russian snow looking miserable. They always show the soldiers cold, tired, defeated, but they never show what these men were actually putting in their mouths to survive. Spoiler alert, it wasn't French cuisine. We're talking about 600,000 men marching into Russia with Napoleon's grand ambitions, and roughly 400,000 of them never made it home. Starvation killed more soldiers than Russian bullets ever did. But here's what gets me. These weren't unprepared idiots. Napoleon was obsessed with logistics. The man invented canned food specifically for military campaigns. He offered 12,000 francs to anyone who could preserve food better. That's roughly $250,000 today for a food storage solution. And yet by December 1812, his soldiers were literally eating their horses, their leather boots, and yes, each other. If you love history, weird stories, and questionable food choices, welcome to Food Storic. Hit subscribe before the frostbite hits. Let's set the scene properly. June 1812, the Grande Armée crosses into Russia. This isn't some ragtag group of hungry peasants. This is the most sophisticated military machine on Earth. Napoleon had spent years perfecting military food supply. His soldiers were supposed to get daily rations of 24 ounces of bread, half a pound of meat, a quarter pint of brandy, and either rice or dried vegetables. That's actually pretty decent, about 3,500 calories per day, which is what you need when you're marching 20 miles daily in full gear. But here's where it gets interesting. Napoleon's plan relied on living off the land. Standard practice for armies back then. You roll into a town, you take their food, you move on. Except Russia had other plans. The Russians burned everything. Crops, villages, food stores, entire cities. Scorched earth tactics, they called it. Imagine marching 20 miles expecting to find a village full of grain, and instead finding smoking ruins. Your carefully calculated food supply system just became toilet paper. The French brought supply wagons, obviously. Thousands of them. But turns out Russian roads were more suggestion than infrastructure. Wagons designed for nice European roads fell apart in Russian mud. Then that mud froze. Wagons that survived the mud shattered in the cold. Horses pulling the wagons started dying by September. No horses means no wagon movement. No wagon movement means no food delivery. See where this is going? By August, things were already sketchy. The official ration got cut in half. 12 ounces of bread, quarter pound of meat. Still survivable, but soldiers were already supplementing. They'd shoot ravens, crows, anything that flew. I found accounts of soldiers paying a month's wages for a single rat. One sergeant wrote that they made soup from leather straps boiled with gunpowder for flavor. The gunpowder apparently added a peppery taste. Gordon Ramsay would cry. September brought new problems. Whatever food they did have was spoiling. No refrigeration, obviously. The preserved meat Napoleon was so proud of. Turns out his contractors had cut corners. Surprise, surprise, military contractors being corrupt. Who could have seen that coming? The meat was already rancid before it left France. Soldiers called it zombie beef because it looked dead, smelled dead, but somehow got worse over time. Men were getting sick from eating their rations before the real starvation even started. Here's where class distinctions matter. Officers still ate okay through September. They had personal servants, cooks, private supplies. A colonel might sit down to wine preserved fruits, even fresh bread, while his men gnawed on boot leather 100 yards away. One lieutenant's diary describes eating roast chicken and drinking Burgundy while watching his men fight over a dead horse. He seemed surprised when they later abandoned him during the retreat. Shocking. October, the temperature dropped and the food situation went from bad to nightmare. Horses started dying faster than they could eat them. You'd think that's good news, right? Free meat. Except a 1,000-pound horse frozen solid in -20 is basically inedible rock. Soldiers would hack at frozen horse carcasses with their bayonets trying to get chunks small enough to thaw. They'd hold raw meat against their bodies trying to defrost it enough to chew. Sometimes the meat would refreeze to their skin. Imagine ripping frozen horse meat off your chest because you're that hungry. But wait, it gets worse. The retreat from Moscow began October 19th. Napoleon's army was already starving, and now they had to march back through the same stripped countryside. Except now, it was frozen. Whatever the Russians hadn't burned was under 3 feet of snow. Soldiers were eating their leather equipment, belts, straps, saddles. Anything leather went into the pot. They'd boil it for hours, trying to make it soft enough to swallow. Leather soup became the military's most common meal. One recipe I found called for 1 leather belt, 2 handfuls of snow, and whatever grass you could dig up. Boil for 3 hours. Season with gunpowder. Serves nobody because you're all going to die. By November, cannibalism entered the chat. And no, I'm not exaggerating for effect. Multiple documented accounts from French, Russian, and Polish sources. It started with already dead frozen comrades. Waste not, want not, right. But here's the truly dark part. Soldiers would wait around the campfires at night, watching for anyone who looked close to death. The moment someone stopped moving, they'd be butchered. Sometimes they weren't quite dead yet. One officer reported finding his sergeant roasting what he thought was horse meat. It was a human thigh. The sergeant offered to share. Military brotherhood at its finest. The officers weren't immune anymore either. Ranks stopped mattering when everyone was starving. A French general wrote about trading his gold watch for 3 potatoes. 3 potatoes for a watch worth thousands of francs. Another colonel mentions paying 100 francs for a spoonful of flour. That's 2 months' salary for a regular soldier. For 1 spoonful. Inflation has nothing on starvation economics. Here's a detail that haunts me. Soldiers would eat their own frostbitten fingers and toes. The logic was terrifyingly practical. The digits were going to fall off anyway from gangrene. Might as well get some calories out of them. Auto-cannibalism. That's how desperate they were. Multiple medical reports from Russian doctors who treated French prisoners describe finding human finger bones in soldiers' stomachs. Imagine being so hungry, you eat parts of yourself. They tried everything. Tree bark became a staple. Pine needles boiled into tea. They'd dig through snow, looking for buried vegetables from the summer harvest. Frozen potatoes were luxury items. Soldiers would suck on buttons, hoping the metal had some nutritional value. It didn't. They'd eat paper money. Also, not nutritious, but at least it filled your stomach for a few minutes. One account describes soldiers eating their own lice. Protein is protein, apparently. The horses that survived became walking emergency rations. Soldiers would secretly drink horse blood. Just a little cut, not enough to kill the horse, but enough to get some liquid calories. Vampire soldiers, basically. When the horse finally collapsed, they'd have a feeding frenzy. Raw meat, organs, blood, everything consumed immediately before it froze. They'd crack open bones to suck out marrow, fight over intestines. The contents of horse stomachs became soup base. Partially digested grass is still technically vegetables. Right? Remember those supply wagons I mentioned? By November, most were abandoned or burned for firewood. But some enterprising soldiers would dig through abandoned wagons, hoping to find anything. One memoir describes finding a wagon full of hair pomade. Fancy stuff for officers' wigs. They ate it. Tasted like perfumed lard, apparently. Another group found a medical wagon. Ate all the pills regardless of what they were for. Mercury pills, quinine, opium didn't matter. Calories are calories when you're dying. Meanwhile, in Paris, Napoleon's bulletins were still claiming everything was fine. Just a strategic withdrawal. Minor supply challenges. The emperor's propaganda machine working overtime while his men ate their boots. He'd abandoned the army in December, leaving them to walk home while he raced back in a heated carriage, probably stopping for hot meals along the way. Leadership. The few soldiers who made it to the Berezina River in late November faced a new horror. Thousands of men trying to cross on hastily built bridges. The crush of starving humanity. Men drowning in freezing water. And the ones who made it across. They found villages already stripped by the first wave of retreating troops. Nothing left but empty buildings and frozen corpses. Which, yes, became food for the next wave. The retreat created its own ecosystem of desperation. What really gets me is the math of starvation. A human needs minimum 1,200 calories just to maintain basic functions. These soldiers were burning 4,000, 5,000 calories a day marching in Arctic conditions, eating maybe 300, 400 calories of leather soup and horse blood. That deficit meant their bodies literally consumed themselves. Muscle tissue first, then organs. Soldiers who started the campaign at 160 pounds came back weighing 90. If they came back, there are accounts of soldiers hallucinating food. Whole units would suddenly smell fresh bread that wasn't there. Men would stuff their mouths with snow thinking it was mashed potatoes. One sergeant's diary describes watching his friend have a full conversation with an imaginary baker, taking orders for croissants. The brain does weird things when you're starving to death. But here's something darkly funny. Some soldiers kept their sense of humor. One memoir mentions finding a group of soldiers who'd made a menu board outside their shelter. Today's special, boot sole bourguignon. Tomorrow, leather strap tartare. Wine list, melted snow vintage Tuesday. Another group was taking food orders like a restaurant. How would Monsieur like his tree bark prepared? Boiled or frozen? Gallows humor at its finest. By December, the survivors were eating things that shouldn't be possible. Gunpowder mixed with snow. Tallow candles when they could find them. One account describes soldiers eating a leather-bound Bible page by page, including the leather cover. Apparently, Revelation tastes worse than Genesis. Who knew? They'd scrape moss off rocks, dig up roots from under ice. One innovative group figured out you could extract tiny amounts of nutrients by boiling rope. Hemp rope specifically. Basically making the world's worst tea. The medical reports from this period are nightmare fuel. Doctors describing soldiers with scurvy so bad their teeth fell out, which actually made eating leather easier. So silver lining, I guess. Men with stomachs full of indigestible material. Leather chunks, wood splinters, human hair. Digestive systems just giving up. One doctor noted finding a soldier who'd eaten his entire ammunition pouch. Leather pouch, lead balls and all. The lead poisoning probably killed him faster than starvation would have. Mercy in a way. Want to know the really messed up part? Some of these starvation foods became weird military traditions. Russian soldiers who witnessed the retreat started making their own leather soup as a dare. French military academies would serve it once a year to remember the campaign. Right up until World War I, French soldiers would joke about Napoleon soup when rations got bad. Trauma becomes tradition, becomes joke. Human coping at its strangest. The few thousand who made it back to France were permanently changed, physically and mentally. Survivors reported never feeling full again. Even years later, they'd hoard food, hide bread under their beds. One veteran became famous for always carrying dried meat in his pockets, even to formal dinners. He'd been a colonel in the Imperial Guard, reduced to nervously checking his pockets for food for the rest of his life. Local French newspapers from 1813 described the horror of seeing these men return. Walking skeletons in tattered uniforms. One journalist wrote about a soldier at a Paris restaurant crying while eating regular bread, just sitting there, sobbing into a baguette, because 6 months earlier, he'd have killed someone for that bread. Literally. The contrast broke something in these men. Some historians estimate only 10,000 combat-effective soldiers made it back from the original 600,000. The rest dead, captured, or so broken, they never fought again. And most of those deaths, starvation and cold. Not Russian bullets or Cossack sabers. Napoleon's greatest enemy was calories, or the lack thereof. All that military genius, and he couldn't figure out how to feed his men in winter. Though to be fair, nobody else had figured it out either. The Russians didn't have it much better, honestly. They burned their own country to starve the French, then had to survive winter in those same burned lands. Russian peasants were eating many of the same things. Tree bark grass soup, boiled leather. The main difference was they knew the terrain, knew which roots were edible under snow, where to find hibernating animals, home field advantage in starvation. This campaign changed military food forever. Every European army started obsessing over preserved rations, better supply lines. The horror stories from Russia drove innovation. Canned food got better. Dried goods improved. Military planners started calculating calories, not just bulk. The Grande Armée ate shoe leather so future armies could have Mister's progress built on frozen corpses. The 1812 campaign produced some of the first detailed nutritional studies too. Doctors analyzing what happens when humans eat non-food items long term. How long can you survive on tree bark? What happens when you digest leather? These weren't academic questions anymore. Thousands of men had run the experiment. Involuntarily. The data was written in gravestones across Eastern Europe. Want to know the most ironic part? Napoleon himself never went hungry during the retreat. Even abandoning his army, he had supply wagons just for him. His personal chef traveled with portable stoves. The emperor ate hot meals while his men gnawed frozen horse meat. He complained in letters about the quality of his traveling wine, while soldiers fermented their own urine to drink, because alcohol doesn't freeze as easily as water. Let that image sink in. The retreat from Moscow remains one of history's greatest examples of logistics failure. All the tactical genius in the world doesn't matter if your men are eating their boots. You can't conquer Russia on leather soup and frozen horse blood. Who would have thought? The lesson every military learned: armies march on their stomachs. Napoleon proved it by having his army's stomachs eat themselves. Modern military rations seem like luxury compared to leather soup. And Mesher might taste like cardboard, but at least it's edible cardboard, with actual calories. Soldiers today complain about menu fatigue. Napoleon's men would have murdered for menu fatigue. Oh no, chicken teriyaki again. Beats the hell out of oh no, my left boot again. The survival stories that came out of this campaign are simultaneously inspiring and horrifying. Human endurance pushed to absolute limits. Men who marched thousands of miles on nothing but willpower and boot leather. They survived experiences that shouldn't be survivable. Eating things that weren't food. Doing things that weren't human. All for an emperor who left them to die. Next time you see a Napoleon documentary focusing on battle tactics and grand strategy, remember this. Those brilliant maneuvers were performed by men eating their equipment. That tactical genius was commanding walking corpses. All the maps and arrows don't show soldiers sucking on buttons for imaginary nutrients. History sanitizes horror into strategy. But the men who lived it knew the truth. War isn't glorious. It tastes like leather and desperation. The Grande Armée of 1812 proved humans will eat literally anything to survive. Leather cloth, metal, wood, paper, each other themselves. The line between food and not food disappears when you're dying. Everything becomes potentially edible. Your belt, your boots, your buddy. Survival strips away civilization faster than Russian. Winter strips away warmth. So that's what Napoleon's soldiers ate to survive Russian winter. Spoiler alert, most didn't survive. The ones who did came back changed forever. Physically ruined, mentally broken, emotionally destroyed. They'd seen what humans become when civilization fails. When the only law is calories. When your best friend starts looking like lunch. The retreat from Moscow wasn't just military failure. It was humanity pushed past breaking point. The last entry in one soldier's diary found on his frozen body simply read, "Ate Michael today. He was my friend. Still hungry." That's what Napoleon's Russian campaign reduced men to. From the greatest army in Europe to cannibals in the snow. In 6 months. All because someone thought invading Russia in summer was a good idea. Forgetting that summer ends. And Russian winter doesn't care about your emperor, your glory, or your empty stomach. Remember this next time you complain about being hungry. You've never been eating your frozen toes, hungry. You've never been your dead friend looks delicious, hungry. You've never been boiling your belt for soup, hungry. And thank whatever God you believe in for that. Because 400,000 men learned what real hunger was in 1812. Most took that knowledge to unmarked graves in the Russian snow. The lucky ones just took it to their nightmares. Bon appetit, I guess.